On today's episode, do we overtrain or under-recover with Dr. Izzy Smith? Welcome to the podcast helping you overcome your proximal hamstring tendinopathy. This podcast is designed to help you understand this condition, learn the most effective evidence-based treatments, and of course, bust the widespread misconceptions. My name is Brodie Sharp. I'm an online physiotherapist, recreational athlete, creator of the Run Smarter series, and a chronic proximal hamstring tendinopathy battler. Whether you are an athlete or not, this podcast will educate and empower you in taking the right steps to overcome this horrible condition. So let's give you the right knowledge along with practical takeaways in today's lesson. When it comes to, lessons that I've learned from doing the Run Smarter podcast and interviewing so many researchers and so many health professionals, I think this is number one of the lessons that I had no idea about or had not much emphasis on until I interviewed Dr. Izzy Smith to talk about this topic around overuse injuries or injury recovery, whether you actually overtrain or under-recover and the equation between the two. So I thought it's a must that I share it with this podcast, with the PHT podcast. And yeah, so today we have Dr. Izzy Smith. This episode was from the Run Smarter podcast, and it was in the middle of what I called Recovery Month. We had a theme that ran throughout December in 2020, where there was 2 episodes a week. One was like an interview with a health professional. The next was me doing a solo episode. And they're all about topics of recovery. And not necessarily from like a running injury, but just from, say, marathons or ultra marathons. And this is one lesson that particularly applies to when it comes to rehab or when it comes to overcoming an injury. And so at the start of the episode, I had a listen through the other day, and there are a few things that we need to catch up on. So I briefly touch on this house analogy when it comes to recovery. And so when you're building a house that needs to become resilient, we think about the weather as being part, or like when your house is subject to harsh weather, we think of that as like external load on the body. And so it's okay for the weather to kind of make some cracks in the glass, or to knock some hinges off a door, or to like lift some tiles off a roof, as long as we're replacing it with something a bit stronger next time. And so that weather kind of roughs around the house a little bit, and the weak links within that house are made quite clear, but we repair those weak links with something stronger, so that next time when the house is subject to harsh weather, we have the same process. We're a little bit more robust, we're a little bit more resilient. And so this can kind of reflect what happens when we are recovering and when we're recovering from injury, because it's not the exercise itself that makes you stronger or makes you resilient. It's the same way that when this weather is battering this house, it's not the weather that makes the house stronger, it's the repair afterwards. And so when it comes to your rehab and your exercise and your return to cardio kind of exercises like running, it's the recovery after that bout of exercise that actually restores and rebuilds. That's the really important part when it comes to recovery. And so I glance over that analogy as expected knowledge. So just thought I'd run you guys up to speed. So these recovery tips can apply to generic kind of training recovery, but can also apply to injury. So let's dive in and take these very valuable lessons on board. Dr. Izzy Smith is an endocrinologist. She studies hormone health and also women's health. She is a podcast host. It's slightly different. It's called Behind the Uniform, and it's talking around mental health. Dr. Izzy Smith is, her Instagram account is Dr. Izzy K. Smith. I'll include the links in the show notes. And I just love the work that she does. And similar to what this podcast is revolved around, she helps people understand their health, helps them understand mental health, and does a lot of posts and tries to get a lot of awareness out there and recent evidence. And it's kind of like that direct to the public type of content. So really love her work. We talk today around overtraining or under recovering. And I did hear Izzy Smith on another podcast, which again I talk about in the interview. I won't delve too much into it, but she talks about this concept of either overtraining or under recovering. Back to our last episode with our house analogy, is it the weather that we subject our house to, or is it our lack of being able to recover from the weathered storm that is decreasing our performance or increasing our risk of injury, or just that inability to thrive as a runner? And so we talk about this concept in a bit more detail, particularly around the hormones and stress and these hormones and chemicals that circulate throughout our body that hinder our ability to recover or enhance our ability to recover. It's really interesting stuff. If we need to understand recovery, we need to understand what's going on in our body. And Dr. Izzy Smith does a perfect job of explaining that without getting too technical. And yeah, we dive into stress and how stress hinders recovery. We talk about whether there's any difference when it comes to psychological stress compared to physical strength, like going out for a run or doing a workout. And yeah, then we do some listener Q&As and tie it all up in a nice little message. So I hope you enjoy. Without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Izzy Smith. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for coming on to our recovery month. I'm excited to talk about this theme and talk about your expertise. So let's start. Thanks for coming on.
No worries, Brody. I've been a fan of your podcast and your Instagram, so I'm excited to now be a part of it.
Brilliant. Likewise, the feeling's mutual. So let's start off by talking about your field of expertise and how you got into the interest that you're in right now.
So I'm a medical doctor. I have been a doctor for 7 years now. I had a bit of a funny path of deciding what I wanted to do career-wise. I'm now an endocrinology doctor, which is hormone health. I initially wanted to work in cancer, which I decided was the most depressing, sad thing and definitely not right for me. I toyed around with sports medicine as a specialty for a little while. However, I realized my passion wasn't, treating injuries. And I also think some parts of sports medicine can be a little bit non-evidence-based, which doesn't completely sit with me. And that's where I fell in love with the concept of sports endocrinology, which is, hormone health, which dictates so much to do with our recovery, our performance. And I think it's an area of sports that hasn't really been, I think it's the next frontier of athletic performance. I think we now know how to train people really well. And the next way to, improve athletic success will be more focusing on how do we get people to recover better. And our hormones are such a big part of that, the, training, stimulus, adaptation. So that's what I'm doing career-wise is, focusing on sports endocrinology. And that's on the background of myself being a very passionate athlete. I'm probably not very good, but I make up for that in enthusiasm and passion. So I'm now, love running and dabbling in triathlon.
Yeah. Talk about your endurance experience at the moment. So you said you've done a bit of running, a bit of triathlons. What's been on the list? What's on your bucket list, and what have you completed?
So I was training for UTA 50 this year, which, as everyone has experienced, most events have been cancelled from COVID. But my running background is I grew up in Tasmania, and I started running as a medical student, mainly to manage stress. I then did the first big event was the Point to Pinnacle, which is a half marathon from the base of, Hobart up to the top of Mount Wellington, which is 1,300 meters of elevation. That's where I fell in love with running. And since then, I've done quite a lot of, trail runs. I like the longer stuff around the marathon distance. Next big things on my list is a half Ironman in Port Macquarie in May. And I know, once you get the buzz, I thought I was just going to do a sprint distance triathlon, and then that moved to an Olympic, and then I'm doing a half Ironman. I know down the track I need to do a full Ironman, or Iron Woman, as I like to call it.
Yeah, very good. The concept, well, just talking about your background and what your interest is, I am pumped that I've got you on just to share around recovery for athletes. And I know we've been following each other's content for a long time now. It wasn't until I think last month I heard you talk on Trang Nguyen's podcast, The Athlete's Garage, and you're talking a little bit about recovery, sickness, that kind of stuff. And you did mention that athletes tend to, when they're injured, they tend to or it's due to either overtraining or under recovering. And I'm like, that's such a perfect concept. It's such a perfect idea, which I hadn't heard of before. Now I hear it all the time, but you were the first one to actually get into my ears and get that concept in there. And I'm like, I've actually stolen it several times being on other podcasts as well. So thanks for that. But
I'll be honest, Brody, I think I stole it from someone else. So
yeah,
you're in the clear.
like I said, it's so simple. It must be around for so long, but it's such a good idea that yes, you can overtrain, which the concept is introduced several times on my podcast. So people know that they can do too much too soon, which leads to injury, or they could do exactly the same as what they're currently doing, but still get an overuse injury from under recovering. So can you maybe just explain this concept of under recovering and what a recreational runner would need to know about that?
I guess when we think about our training and our athletic goals, we just think about the hard work. When in reality, and we think it's the hard work that gets us fitter, stronger, faster. However, in reality, it's the rest after the hard work where we do the adaptations from the stress of training, that's when we're getting the benefit. So I like to say, we don't get fitter, faster, stronger from training. We get fitter, faster, stronger from the rest we do after training. So that recovery is when we get our adaptations, when we get our gains, and there's so many factors that impact that, post-training recovery and our potential to get the full maximum benefit from our training, as well as, recovering for the next session. So from a recreational runner perspective, really important things to think about are what are you doing beyond your running? So for people, for example, who may, you're a physiotherapist, you might be on your feet for 10 hours a day. If you're doing a training session in the morning, really hard, and then you're on your feet all day, your body doesn't have time to recover properly and, get its adaptations. Or if you're having a rest day, which we know is really important for training, is to have, one rest day at least, once a week. I think you might have shared something a while ago that was for athletes that were having less than 2 rest days or 1 rest day a week had a much increased chance of getting an injury. But so, so looking at your rest days, are you properly resting on your rest days? If you've got a lot of psychological stress, you're on your feet, you're doing more than 10,000 steps, that's not a rest day. So my thing is, when we talk about under recovering, it's, are you getting the maximum benefit from your training?
Great. And I think it's my very, very first episode of the podcast was adaptation education and making sure people understand the importance of the body adapting to the loads you want it to put it through or how strong you want to get. And it's awesome that you illustrate that point that it's not during the actual exercise where your body adapts. Your body actually adapts when you're not exercising and you are trying to utilize that recovery session as much as you can. And that might not necessarily be not running. It's actually like a complete load off and, maybe walking around and going to work, your body's still you might not feel like you're exercising, but you're definitely not recovering. Is that right?
Yeah. And the other really important factor to talk about is psychological stress. We think about stress when we train, it's a very physical stress on our body, and we're flooding our system with stress hormones such as noradrenaline and cortisol. However, when we are psychologically stressed, we are releasing the same hormones. We're releasing the noradrenaline, we're releasing the cortisol that prevent the rest and the adaptations. So if we are, getting pumped at work, if you're a uni student and you're studying for exams, your body's actually stressed, all the time, and you're not giving it that time to recover. And your individual cells, when we are psychologically stressed, our muscle cells can't really tell the difference between, physical training stress or psychological stress because it's the same hormones that are acting on every single cell in our bodies. So I think that's something really important for people to look into is psychological stress and the impact that has on training load. And we know with athletes, there's a lot of studies that show, looking at university and college students, just before exams, their training and performance usually drops. And it shows, your total load is impacted by that stress. And you might not be able to push as hard just because you're under recovered from when you're starting.
Keeping in mind that the listeners don't have much of a scientific background, we can try and keep this as simplistic as we can. Can you, in your best way, explain why we can't recover when these hormones are circulating around the body?
Yeah. So firstly, I'll explain what a hormone is. So hormones are our body's messenger systems. Often people think of hormones as just being sex hormones like testosterone or estrogen. However, in reality, we have, 9, 10 different hormone systems from, melatonin that tells us to sleep to our adrenal glands that produce cortisol that's important with blood pressure management, blood sugar management. Um, your thyroid produces hormones that manages metabolism. And so hormones work by traveling to different parts of your body. That's what makes it a hormone. It travels through the blood and then acts on a different organ. When I talked about the stress hormones, we evolved from our hunter-gatherers, and our behavior has changed very rapidly in the last 1,000 years, but our bodies haven't evolved very much. So often we hear about the flight or fight response. And that's, when we're stressed, we get that big flood of noradrenaline and cortisol because that primal brain thinks there's a threat. There's some kind of woolly mammoth that we need to run away from because it's going to eat us. So when we're psychologically stressed, we get big floods of stress hormones and they prepare our body for a fight. That's to, run really fast, our blood vessels dilate, our blood sugar levels go up to, prepare our body. In that primal brain, when you're stressed, it doesn't worry about recovery. It's not caring about, healing your body from the day. It has more important things to do. It's trying to keep you safe. The issue is now in our, switched on 24/7, stressful jobs, never having any time to unwind. We're often stressed all the time. So we have those high levels of noradrenaline and cortisol, then, big two stress hormones. If they're always going to be high, our body's never going to be able to go back into that repair system to recover the muscles, and let those adaptations happen because it's always thinking, okay, I need to keep you safe from this threat. So that's why, things like meditation and mindfulness and winding down, not just important for our minds, but also really important for our bodies.
Okay. So from a hormone perspective, it's sort of treated the same whether you are under psychological stress like exams or work or kids and family, all that kind of thing, compared to actual physical stress, which would be doing a hard, intense workout, that kind of thing.
Absolutely 100% correct.
Wow. Okay. And then goes without saying, which what you said before, if you have that noradrenaline, cortisol circulating around in the body then won't have the opportunity to recover because it's the hormone
preparing for a fight or flight. Yeah,
exactly.
It's not preparing to rest, digest, recover, heal your body from the day's, physical training.
Right. I wanted to cover stress as the general topic of today, but before we dive into maybe specifics, are there any other common areas around this whole like preventative of adaptation that people underutilize or some recreational runners might undervalue that you see that's like inhibiting their recovery?
Yes, the most obvious simple one would be sleep. And I think that goes for health and well-being a lot. Often we, want to cherry pick the things at the top. We think eating goji berries or, superfoods or whatever rubbish is important for our health, when it's really the basics of, eating enough fruits and veggies, getting enough sleep, doing a bit of exercise. And recovery is the same. Sleep and managing, mental well-being would be the most important things for recovery. We are humans and we are, complex biology, and our bodies are designed to have, 8 hours sleep. We try and shortcut this, we're trying to, we've got artificial lights now keeping us awake for longer, but really our bodies are designed to, sleep when it goes dark. And if you think about melatonin and, that's released when it goes dark, it makes sense. Biologically, we're supposed to sleep when it's dark, which is 8 hours. People try and shortcut this and think they can, cope with sleeping only 6 hours a night. But like I said, we're biology, we're not robots. So I think prioritizing sleep is so important. Also looking after mental well-being. And, I'm not a dietitian, but the other one is, making sure nutritionally you're meeting your needs. And something I think a lot of runners fall into the mistake of is thinking, protein is for your gym junkies who are trying to get big muscles. And like I say, running is, thousands of single leg squats over and over again. We actually have a really high rate of muscle breakdown. So making sure you're getting enough protein as well as your other macros are definitely, the basis of good recovery.
Cool. I did want to get another guest on later in the month to talk around sleep. So I think it's important that people realize the importance of hormones when it comes to sleep, when it comes to stress. So very good that we illustrate that. But we might hone in on the stress component for today's episode.
Sure. I will say just one thing about the sleep and hormones is our circadian rhythm, and our hormones are on a 24-hour clock. So, our cortisol, our testosterone, our growth hormone, all, fluctuate during the day, and that's dependent on sleep. So that is why, as well as sleeping 8 hours, also, when we sleep and, our body clock is quite important as well.
Cool. If we are just adding in a little bit more value, any tips for people to help improve their sleep?
Everyone is different, but some really simple stuff, cutting out caffeine after midday, getting off our phones at night. The blue light comes in through, looks at our retina, through our supranucleus, supranucleus goes to our brain, suppresses melatonin release. So, cutting out blue light is really important, having some time to wind down, getting up at the same time every day, and also trying to avoid napping too late in the day.
Brilliant. Fantastic.
I could talk about sleep for an hour, but these are really basic things. Personally, I love the Calm app, which is like sleep music and sleep stories. As someone who's been a shift worker, I know that's been a complete game changer for my sleep.
Yeah, I've used the Calm app as well, and also a big fan. Regarding stress, if stress hinders recovery, what are the recommendations that you might suggest if, let's just say someone's training for a marathon and they've got a job promotion, and that is like some unavoidable high levels of stress for a certain period of time, but they still want to continue building their marathon training plan. If they've recognized that they're under high levels of stress, what would be some recommendations to reduce their risk of injury and help aid recovery?
I feel like you would be able to answer this question as well, Brody. But something I would talk about is accepting that you might not be able to train at as high intensities during high levels of psychological stress. As I said, your body already has a certain amount of load, so it just might not be able to tolerate that higher load of a very high intensity session. So that is something I would recommend, of maybe decreasing the load but maintaining the volume. Obviously, with the job stress, that is unavoidable, but still trying to find some time to actively decrease those stress hormones through, whether it's mindfulness, listening to a guided meditation. There's actually now quite a lot of evidence that is developing for things, activities like mindfulness and meditation. And this is someone, as I hate trying to meditate, I'm terrible at it. I'm trying to get better. And it's something I think people need to accept. It takes time, learning to meditate and become mindful it's like getting fit. We're not going to be really good at it straight away, and it can take a bit of time, but the evidence shows it's really great. Also, the other thing, when you do have that stressful job, trying to still get in enough sleep, avoiding alcohol as well, because that's going to muck up your sleep, that's going to increase your stress, and seeing what other stressors in your life you can take out. I'm all about outsourcing. So if you've got a really busy, stressful job and it's important to you, what other stresses can you get in your life? I get food prep, and I'm very fortunate I get my house cleaned, because, removing those other stressful activities, helps me focus my energy on the things I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, cool. And
I know that is an incredibly privileged answer, so I'm sorry. I know not everyone has the financial capacity to get a house cleaner, but it's, removing the stressors that, aren't a high priority.
And it just goes to show that you can be creative at identifying other stresses that might be around and being creative in removing those or allocating those to other people, so that your total psychological stress is decreased. And that would ultimately mean that you can start recovering, or at least tolerating a little bit more load if you decrease your levels of stress, which is really cool.
I talk about the stress cup, and we all have a stress cup that at one point it's going to fill up. And whether that's psychological stress and physical stress, and we are only human, we are biology, there's only so much we can handle. So seeing what you can do to try and take out that stress cup before it overflows. And, physical stress and psychological stress, I say, are quite common because we can only handle so much psychologically until we'll break. In the same way, our bodies can only handle so much physically until it will break. So, seeing what we can do to take away some of that load. And as you said, in the stressful job, if someone's on their feet all the time, can they have some time off their feet? Ways you can decrease both your physical and your psychological stress.
Yeah. I might get a bit of backlash for this, but I'm also a fan of knowing that psychological stress in a lot of situations is kind of like internally driven. Like it's the person themselves that makes it stressful, rather than like someone could have a stressful job, but it just doesn't affect them the same way it might affect someone else. Like someone might affect psychologically, they're constantly wired up with high levels of stress because they're taking on, like, say, personal responsibilities, or they just don't respond too well to either being yelled at or having like deadlines or pressure, that kind of thing.
Well,
And
that's of course that's makes sense, and we are all different, and that would be working and being self-aware and working on your own mental fitness. I think often when we talk about mental health, we talk about it as if it's mental illness and then people being really mentally well. In reality, there's a very big spectrum between the two, and most people sit somewhere in the middle. And at different periods, you might be a little bit more, mentally unwell. You might not have a mental illness, but you'll be under more psychological stress. And the reality is of life, hard things are going to happen. COVID has taught us that hardships will happen, and it's about developing skills and a support network. So when those hard things happen, it doesn't have such an impact and load on you. So you're right, everyone will adapt to different experiences and experience stress in different ways. And psychological stress itself isn't necessarily bad. That's how we become more resilient. It's about being aware, like with our physical training, that's short stresses on the body, being aware and, getting some practices in place so you decrease that mental stress and, slide back towards the mentally well.
great. And yeah, having that support network like you suggested, and perhaps using like the Calm app and practicing like some self-awareness or meditation or breathing exercises, they're all really good strategies as well. Back to the scenario of someone who might be training for a marathon and experiencing high levels of stress. I think there's also just knowing that you can, if you're following a running program, you can swap out some days here and there. You can adjust your week. Let's just say on a Sunday, Monday, you've recognized you are particularly stressed and you haven't been sleeping too well. Just take out your hard session and replace it with an easy session. Do your hard session later in the week when you have started sleeping better, or you have felt a little bit more recovered. That might be a really nice strategy as well.
And the good thing to point out is, if you are really under recovered, your body's not going to be able to tolerate the load and get the benefits from that high intensity session anyway. So apart from the fact it's going to, just make you feel probably worse, you're not going to get the benefit from that really hard session anyway. And it can be really hard, especially for type A personalities, when they have a running plan that says, I do this and this, and it's really nice to tick those things off the box, tick them off as we go. And I think that's, as we become more experienced as a runner, we get better learning and recognizing our own body and when we do need to have those days off. And, I think that's where you'll see those really, high elite athletes. They know when they need to have a session off. They're not monitoring their heart rate. They're not doing anything tech savvy to know they're under recovered. Most of the time, they just know their body's well enough and know they need to, decrease the intensity or take a rest day.
Yeah, I did have the question written down around, should we base our decisions off feel, or is there a way that we can measure our stress and kind of say, all right, I'm not doing well in this area, let me make this decision? Or is it like what you said, just what athletes are doing, they just know?
It's the year 2020 and we have so many different wearables and way to monitor, track absolutely everything. It's important to recognize a lot of the things we do use for tracking, such as our sleep monitoring, our heart rate monitoring. A lot of them haven't been calibrated to see if they're evidence-based. So, I don't know if my Garmin, when it tells me I've had 2 or 3 hours of deep sleep, we don't know if that's actually true. So that's something that's important to recognize. 2, there's most of the evidence shows that we have all the data in the world, but that hasn't been shown to be more effective of being able to recognize, the feeling of if you're under or over, if you're not recovered or ready for the next session. The third thing is sometimes those tracking, all the different data we can collect can become a bit of a stressor on itself. if you do have an important game or training session and you feel good, but then your watch tells you, hey, you are, under recovered, or you haven't got enough sleep, but you feel great, that's probably going to stress you out more and impact your performance. So I think, there's definitely benefits of different technology and data, but it's important to recognize, one, we don't know how evidence-based it is, and two, the best evidence we've got doesn't really show it's more effective than knowing how we feel.
I definitely recognize that because I wear an Oura ring when I go to sleep, and I definitely recognize I shouldn't be paying attention to the sleep stages that it gives me. I think in the past, listening to sleep scientists and that, you really need to go into a sleep lab and have like those electrodes on the head to really measure what phase of the sleeping cycle you're in.
And like I said, you need the polysomnography where we measure all the electrodes on your brain, which, obviously the watch doesn't do.
Yeah, absolutely. If we're looking at someone who is particularly stressed and hasn't done any meditation or the Calm app or practicing mindfulness or breathing or anything, what would be your recommendations for like somewhere to start? Well, they don't have a high education on strategies to do. What would be your first starting point?
Learning how to be present and not distracted by technology. I really encourage people to go for walks without their phone. So often we are connected to devices 24/7, and we're never actually just present in ourselves. And I think we need to learn how to be present in ourselves, because that's how we start to recognize how we're feeling. Are we exhausted? Are we stressed? And how can we become self-aware if we're constantly distracted by devices, laptops, movies? And, I'm no better than anyone else. Sometimes I'm sitting at home watching a movie with my laptop on my lap, doing work, and I've got my phone. I'm like, this is just absolutely ridiculous. So yes, learning to just be present in yourself. So, whether it's a walk without your phone, sitting down by the beach for 10 minutes and just sitting there. I'd really recommend trying to take time off technology, or even reading a book. Reading a book, you need to be present. You can't be, if you're watching a movie, you can do what I do with my laptop and my phone. Reading a book, you have to be present. And I think it can be quite confronting when you realize how hard it is to read a book these days, because we're just so used to our attention constantly being grabbed. So that would be my advice, just some really simple measures.
Cool. One of your topics when you're talking to Trang that I really love, that I haven't talked much about on the podcast, was sickness and your boosting or inhibiting your immunity. If we're under high levels of stress and we are under recovering, are we at a higher risk of developing some level of sickness?
Yeah. Short answer, yes. So our immune function is definitely most active when we are sleeping, and when that parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxed nervous system, is predominantly on. Because if you think back to what I said about, that primal person who's running away from the woolly mammoth that wants to eat them, at that time, their body's priority is not their immune system or fighting an infection. And, the cortisol actually has a suppressive effect on our immune system. So, high levels of stress do increase the risk of getting, coughs and colds. The other thing is sleep deprivation. There was a study a while ago, it's a great study. They showed people who were sleeping 6 hours or less a night. They injected rhinovirus, which is the most common virus that causes coughs and colds. They injected rhinovirus into people's nasal flares, and people that slept less than 6 hours were 4.5 times more likely to get a cough or cold than the people that were sleeping 7 hours or more. And If you think about it, that's amazing. And I know for me, whenever I have a late night, if I, go out, I always get a cough or a cold afterwards. And the other thing, apart from getting sick, you're also going to probably miss a few training sessions. And we know consistency is one of the most important, predictors of athletic success. And so, yes, one, sleep deprivation has a big impact on our immune function. Most antibodies are made when we're sleeping. Immune function is, predominantly working at night. And that makes sense. When you're sick, you just bloody want to sleep. Sometimes you'll go home and sleep 5 hours in the middle of the day. And what is going on? And that's your immune system, being active, and your body telling you need to rest, because your immune system needs to, be working hard right now. And yes, the psychological stress, cortisol has a suppressive effect on our immune system.
Okay. And I think if someone, to say, is trying to become a better runner, trying to increase their running performance, trying to prepare for a race, they may have experienced how 1 or 2 weeks of a sickness can knock them out and set them back in their training plans as well. So I think not only are we trying to boost recovery to reduce our risk of injury, but also reduce the risk of sickness can be really beneficial for performance.
Yeah, and something I would say of, someone who's sick for a couple of weeks, I really recommend, if you do have a cough or cold, just completely resting for 2 days. Our bodies, because of all of those factors of, cortisol and sleep being so important, if we're trying to push on with a low grade cold, we might be able to do our training sessions. They're not going to be very good, but that's when you see a cold linger for 2 weeks. Stay at home, have 2 proper days of rest where you're not trying to get work done. You're actually psychological and physical, rest, and that will get you so much better. Get you better so much quicker, and be able to get you back to training at, full capacity much quicker.
Yeah. And that kind of ties in with what we're talking about at the start. If you're sick and your body's trying to fight a sickness and you're say, oh, let's just do a light session, or let me just stay on my feet all day. I won't do a hard session, but let me just go for a run and I'll just take it super easy. You're still giving yourself some physical stress that, like we said before, we need to flip the equation and really get into that rest recovery mode rather than that exercise mode.
100%. You want to keep, your heart rate low. And because I do say to athletes, I always get asked, should I train when I'm sick? And I say, really trying to keep your heart rate, if you are going to train, zone 1. I don't want it going above 120, 130, which for most people means, a walk or a very slow jog. Because we know once you start to get your heart rate up, that's when your, sympathetic nervous system kicks in and you do have those suppressive immune effects. Great.
We're getting better, more value than I have written down on my page here. So this is great. We're delving into a lot more. Is there, if a runner is loving this and learning a whole bunch, while we're on the topic of hormones, are there any other hormones or any other topics around hormones that a runner might need to know when it comes to recovery?
I could get a little bit complex and we could talk about, growth hormones and what type of training we do for, growth hormone peaks. But I think it's probably getting a little bit scientific and a bit theoretical.
Yeah.
The other thing that I guess, which is very, very relevant, is the importance of our sex hormones for athletic performance. So that's, testosterone and estrogen, so for men and women. And, testosterone is also important for women as well. And that's important for, muscle growth, that type of thing. So relative energy deficiency syndrome is getting a lot of press at the moment, which is excellent. And that stands for relative energy, I already said it, REDS, relative energy deficiency syndrome in sport. You may have heard it being called female athlete triad, and that's standard for disordered eating, losing periods, and, bone health problems. Repetitive stress fractures is what people say. Have they realized it occurs in men as well? So, men can get low testosterone, and that's where you'll start seeing decreased performance, increased coughs and colds. And obviously they don't have, periods as a warning sign, but, loss of morning erection is what we say is the kind of the equivalent of amenorrhea in women, and amenorrhea standing for loss of periods. And so that is, something that we see in very lean athletes or athletes that are dropping a lot of weight quickly. However, it's also important to recognize that it's not just in lean people. If someone, increases their training load really quickly without increasing their nutrition, their body's going to say, I don't have enough energy, and it will shut down different organ systems. So not shut down, but it will give less energy. So what we see is, people getting coughs and colds, they lose their periods, their bone health goes off. And that's, very relevant to recreational and professional athletes.
I think it's worth, when we're talking about this, because now we're delving into nutrition, which is great. It's
jumping a bit out of my lane. I'm sorry.
I love it. It's important to recognize that recovery, your body needs energy to recover. It needs nutrients. It needs, while you're resting, it's utilizing the energy stores to recover. Goes to the muscles, bones, tendons, everything like that. It's redirecting and reprioritizing where it sends that energy. And so what you're saying is someone's like dramatically, like if they're not getting the amount of nutrients required for recovery, then the body's going to use all of that energy stores when you're physically working out, but then it just won't have anything left when it comes to the recovery component side of things. And so that's why nutrition is really important. Make sure that's on our priority list.
And that's, unfortunately, we see athletes who think on their rest days they don't need to eat as much, when really, adaptions and, physical improvements, it's a catabolic process. We need those extra calories. So, rest days, nutrition is super important as well. And like you said, it's, our body will be giving energy to, just be able to do the training, but it won't get the performance improvements, and other things will start going wrong, bone health, short-term infertility, immune problems, and, mental health as well. Not having enough your nutrients, calories, just for your brain to function properly.
Yeah. Let's dive into some listener Q&As. And this is a really nice segue to what Carl asks. A man of few words. He just put supplements -magnesium ? And I assume he's asking, is there any supplements that we can take to help recovery? And what are your thoughts on magnesium for recovery?
So first we'll go back to saying, remember, the most important thing we can do is, adequate sleep, managing our mental health, then getting enough calories and, a varied diet. Then once we get more towards the top, we're looking at things like, massage, ice baths. And that's when I think, supplements would probably go a bit around, around those top areas. Magnesium is probably, very popular with athletes. And, there's a little bit of evidence that it can actually help with sleep and relaxation. Not strong evidence, but it's important to recognize that it's hard to get good evidence in athletic performance and some musculoskeletal things. It is a bit easy because magnesium's a tablet, so you can have a placebo. But, there's just not the drug companies doing these big powered trials because, magnesium's cheap as chips, so why would they? But yes, there is evidence that magnesium can help a little bit with sleep and relaxation. We know sleep is very important for recovery. 2, if people are magnesium deficient, and this is a really important concept to talk about in supplements. Saying supplements don't benefit people is provided their levels are replete. If you're deficient in vitamin B or vitamin D or magnesium, supplementing them, of course, will make you feel better and help you perform better. So magnesium deficiency is not uncommon. So for people that are deplete, they will definitely get benefits. The third thing I would say is placebo effect is real, and there's nothing wrong with placebo effect. And, people do feel like taking magnesium, whether it is helping their stiff muscles or not. If they think it helps, there's nothing wrong with that. Magnesium, it's a pretty hard supplement to overdose on. As a doctor, I've never seen any complications from hypomagnesemia. So I think if people feel like it's working, why not? The other thing is, we are now seeing popularity of magnesium sprays and creams. There isn't really the evidence to show that magnesium could be systemically absorbed. Our skin's a pretty great barrier. It's there to keep nasty things out of our body. So do we know the magnesium is absorbed through the skin into the muscles? We don't. So I would probably recommend more oral magnesium than the creams. Maybe the creams have a bit better placebo effect. Also recognizing that magnesium can cause diarrhea, and running guts plus lots of magnesium supplements could be problematic. But yeah, I think anecdotally we see a lot of athletes saying it helps with cramps and stiff muscles.
Okay, so if anything, for the recovery component, there is low level evidence, so that it can aid with sleep, but it's kind of like something you might try as at the top of the pyramid, whereas we want to make sure that you are getting good sleep, nutrition, or like dealing with the stresses in your life as the base. And then you might want to try, once you've covered all of those, you might want to try some magnesium. Maybe, do you get blood tests to see if you're low in magnesium?
You can, but the reality of doing blood tests are the levels fluctuate so much from a day-to-day basis. And the other thing with blood tests for things like magnesium, vitamin D, they're done on a general population. We don't have, trials showing, what's the peak magnesium levels for athletes that are training, 1-2 times a day. So You can get blood tests if to see if you were deficient. However, I don't really think there'd be that much utility in them, in honesty, because one, levels fluctuate on a day-to-day basis. Two, the cutoffs of what we decide are normal are based on a general population of a confidence interval of where most people fit.
Yeah. Any other supplements that you think might help someone who's doing everything correctly but wants to get that extra 1% for recovery? Anything you might suggest?
Yeah. I won't go into sports supplements because that's a bit out of my lane, beta alanine and those type of things. However, vitamin D is something that is, in the literature quite a lot at the moment. And I think it was BMJ did a good study showing that athletes supplemented with vitamin D, it can help performance, and athletes may be at increased risk of vitamin D deficiency and have higher requirements than the general population. Not that anecdotes are evidence, but I supplement with vitamin D. I'm really worried about, I'm very cautious about skin cancer and sun damage. So I think, vitamin D is one that lots of athletes could benefit from. Vitamin D, magnesium, I think they would be the main ones. The varied diet is definitely going to be the most important one. The other thing is, we're seeing a massive increase in plant-based athletes. I am one of them. But, having enough adequate protein post-training, we are seeing evidence, especially if people are training twice a day, for improved recovery with protein supplementation.
Okay, so if you find that you're lacking in protein, if you find you're lacking in vitamin D, make sure that they're supplemented, or make sure that you're getting adequate levels of those to help performance and aid recovery.
Spot on.
Okay, great. Our next Q&A question comes from Amanda, and she asks around anti-inflams. She's heard a couple of things, a couple of different opinions to have anti-inflams before a run or during a run or after a run, or not taking them at all. And so she's heard all these different opinions and wondering if we could help with clarifying a lot of this. She also mentioned that it's mainly for her arthritic knees. So it's mainly around that condition. So can we clear this up at all?
Without, seeing someone's knee MRIs and knowing, their grade of osteoarthritis and their medical comorbidities, I definitely can't. And that's why, especially asking advice from, your running friends or your coach, or, no offense, your physio, who probably doesn't have that background in prescribing medications and some of the, the side effects and complications. There's really no one size fits all for people. And it's about, individual basis. However, I would say, so first, just talking about what an anti-inflammatory medication is. They work on, the COX-1 and 2 enzyme pathways, and they decrease kind of prostaglandins that can cause inflammation and pain. So that's why they're called an anti-inflammatory. A few things, one, in mild osteoarthritis, it's important to talk about pain and what, slightly sore knees mean, the significance of pain. We know in arthritis, exercise is actually, and physical activity is quite good for arthritis, and it can, actually prevent worsening. So thinking about what the pain is, what are the concerns? Are you worried that the pain is exacerbating the arthritis? And what are your goals for taking the anti-inflammatories? It's because you can't get through the run without them? Or are you concerned that the pain in itself is, a warning sign and bad? The other thing would be, I would be concerned if people were relying on anti-inflammatories to run, if they couldn't get through a run without those anti-inflammatories. These medications do have side effects, looking at GI ulceration, increased risk of bleeding. And, I'll talk a little bit about kidney injury for endurance events and anti-inflammatories. So yes, I wouldn't want someone to have to rely on anti-inflammatories all the time. Occasionally if we're a little bit sore, if you're doing a lot of kilometers, training for an ultra or a marathon, you're going to have aches and pains. That's the reality of it. And an occasional anti-inflammatory is fine. And then thirdly, if we're looking at people with quite severe arthritis, people do take anti-inflammatories, all the time, but that would really be that severe osteoarthritis where I don't think people would be able to run. So that's a bit of an all over the place answer. But one, I would say, anti-inflammatories, they're not going to, worsen the arthritis or the knee pain. Two, I wouldn't want someone though needing them every single run. That would be a bit of a red flag for me, and I think you probably need to see a specialist. 3, how bad's the pain? It doesn't necessarily mean there's damage, and is it actually arthritis? Could it be patellofemoral syndrome? Is there something else going on? And I think for complex issues like this is when a sports medicine physician can be really great, because if you see a orthopedic surgeon, sometimes they might just say, "Oh, just stop running." To runners, that's like world shattering. Sports medicine physicians really want to keep people training and keep people running, but they've got that medical background of knowing when it's appropriate to prescribe medications and some non-operative, measures for things like arthritis.
Very well said on such a complex topic.
The other thing I'm just going to say about, anti-inflammatories is, a lot of endurance events now are banning them because they do increase the risk of kidney injury, which can, result in rhabdomyolysis. I can never say that, muscle breakdown. So they can decrease the blood flow to kidneys. A 45-minute run, half marathon, probably fine. Running 10, 12 hours, I definitely wouldn't want people to be taking anti-inflammatories.
Okay. A few things I will add. When it comes to the arthritic condition, if we're talking about cortisol and these hormones that circulate around the body, if someone is getting decreased levels of sleep and is under particular high levels of stress and it circulates a lot of cortisol in the body, that can actually be a direct correlation to arthritic like sensitivity, like the structures around, let's just say it's an arthritic knee and that kind of thing. And that making sure that all of those concepts and all of those recovery strategies are in place, and not just like having really poor sleep and then just taking anti-inflammatories because their knee's sore. If you want to really make sure you decrease the sensitivity of those tissues, we want to talk about all of that, all those recovery strategies we've already mentioned in this episode.
Well, definitely, we know psychological stress is associated with increased pain. And that's probably, I'm sure there's some survival instinct reasons for that. And, you're 100% right that as well the inflammation from stress, because we know inflammation and stress and mental health are related, is also going to worsen the knee pain as well. Which exercise is amazing because it has a short-term inflammatory effect, but its overall impact is anti-inflammatory. And that's why, exercise is actually really good for arthritis.
Yeah. And you might be able to help me out with this one as well. In the injury acronym of peace and love with when it comes to acute injuries and overuse injuries, the A in peace and love stands for avoid anti-inflammations. I think that would be for overuse injuries like a tendinopathy and those kind of soft tissue injuries. Can you shine any light on that?
So what they're talking about is an anti-inflammatory, as it says, it's decreasing inflammation, and it's actually inflammation that is involved in the healing process. As an example, you cut your skin, and as it's healing, it gets a bit red and itchy. And that's actually, inflammation that's causing that red and itchiness, but it's also helping the tissue repair. We have a sprained muscle. That's the same thing. The inflammation is actually involved in the healing process. A sprained ankle, often it feels quite warm. That's inflammation. It's part of the healing. So there is, thoughts now that, anti-inflammatories could actually inhibit part of that healing process. A soft tissue injury is very different to, maybe some sore, feeling a little bit aches and pains and sore muscles after a heavy training session. And, I think that's all right every now and then to take an anti-inflammatory. There is, theoretical risks and concerns of taking anti-inflammatories could decrease, adaptations to training. So let's say you've done a really hard session, your muscles are sore. Taking the anti-inflammatory could decrease those adaptations. It's important to think about, yes, this is, on a scientific perspective, it's right. The anti-inflammatories will decrease some of those inflammatory cytokines, but they're definitely not going to decrease all of them. And it's important to look at outcomes, not just methodology. Because often we can look at amazing scientific studies and things make lots of sense from a, cellular level, but do we actually see the outcomes in people? So what was I saying? I guess what I was saying is anti-inflammatories, do have that they can decrease some of those maybe adaptations, but if you need the anti-inflammatories to, fit in your next training session the next day, maybe it is beneficial from a whole perspective, get that extra training in, potentially lose a little bit of the adaptations from the anti-inflammatories. but they're not going to all be gone. It's not like they can just magically decrease all inflammation from that hard session.
Yeah, so some good takeaways around the use of anti-inflammations as well. That's really nice.
Yeah, it's nuanced and complex, and there's no strict, guidelines. But, we are saying now for an acute injury, try and avoid anti-inflammatories for 3 days. Your sprained ankles, torn muscle. After that, if it's still hurting a little bit, you're probably fine to take them because, most of that healing should start to happen, especially with like an ankle sprain.
Yeah. Well, at least I think as long as the listener can go away with knowing that it's not just the answer, like if you have an injury, it's not just take anti-inflams and that's the direct like response you should do for an injury like that.
Great.
We have covered so much on today's episode, more than I thought we would, but I guess with your level of expertise and the amount of knowledge you have, we take on these tangents that are full of value. So
hope I didn't waffle too much.
No, it was good. People waffle, but like this type of waffling is just more and more value, which is what I love. So I really love your ability to like seek out the most recent evidence, and you seem extremely passionate around like the people that you serve and your level of like the field that you've chosen. You've just constantly like looking at the research and following you through social media, and that I can tell that you have a passion for constantly wanting to learn and constantly wanting to educate people. So we tend to share the same ambitions with that, just trying to relay and get people the right information. So if someone wants to learn more about your content and love hearing about what the expertise that you have, where can people find more about you?
Firstly, I'll say thank you. That's really nice of you to say that, Brody. And I think, as you said, passionate about being up to date with evidence. Things are changing so drastically. You look at how people used to train for endurance events, 50 years ago, and it was, hard training sessions. And now we're seeing that what's most important is, consistency, and what maintains a long athletic career is, more low volume training and then, a little bit of really hard speed work. So that's why it's so important to stay up to date with knowledge rather than say, this is how we've always done things, because knowledge is changing and research, and especially in the sports world. So, and, the peace and love and the avoiding of anti-inflammatories is a great example of that. Everyone used to recommend to ice injuries straight afterwards. So, and I think that's where it's so good for practitioners to keep their egos in check. It's nothing wrong with you if you used to do something that we've now realized might not be the right method. It's just that science is evolving and you want to be part of that journey and do the best thing for your athletes. So anyway, thank you. And if people want to follow or see any of the content I share, I mainly do stuff on Instagram, which is I've got a blog called Dr. Izzy Smith. I also, if you're interested in mental health, have a mental health podcast called Behind the Uniform, which was partnered with Fox Sports, so a lot of athletes. Quite some heavy mental health stuff, but I think really valuable as well. And I think that's the main platforms.
Fantastic. I'll link those into the show notes, including the podcast and including the Instagram link. So if people want to go there, they can just click on the show notes, click on the link, and it'll take you straight there. Izzy, once again, thanks for coming on. Thanks once again for listening and taking control of your rehab. If you are a runner and love learning through the podcast format, then go ahead and check out the Run Smarter podcast, hosted by me. I'll include the link along with all the other links mentioned today in the show notes. So open up your device, click on the show description, and all the links will be there waiting for you. Congratulations on paving your way forward towards an empowering, pain-free future. And remember, knowledge is power.